Catherine.
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
So tell me all about Dan and your experience with him in preschool meetings.
I would love to talk about our preschool meeting experience. We had some fantastic teachers when Dan was in preschool. We also had several brand new teachers and one teacher that I would rank on the needs improvement scale. The fantastic teachers always did a great job at communicating. So they made sure, because Dan is nonverbal and Dan was very young, we were still in the early diagnosis phase. We hadn't received an autism diagnosis yet. We learned when he was 1.5 that he had epilepsy. So he started preschool at age 3. We had transitioned from an IFSP and home-based services into our local preschool, and we're very nervous about that. This was going to be Dan's first experience not being with us, with his family, with being with strangers in a strange facility. Because Dan was completely nonverbal, we were very concerned about what was going to be happening during the day. If he was going to be hurt or sick, how would he communicate that? If somebody hurt him, how would we know that? A lot of the signs of abuse for a child with disabilities who are nonverbal can be masked by other things like illness and just the very nature of their disability. So we were really concerned about that. And the first 2 teachers we worked with were fantastic at really providing us with kind of that open door policy, come in and visit at any time. They were great about communicating with us as we were coming in and out of school, calling if they had any questions during the day, just saying, hey, Dan seems to be really tired, or Dan is crying, can you give me a heads up, this is what's going on in the classroom. So they did a great job. One of the more challenging experiences we had was with a newer teacher who was really struggling with her skills. And I came to pick Dan up, and Dan had epilepsy, and one of the dangers of epilepsy is called status. And in the state of status, your brain is in a constant state of seizing, and that can lead to very extensive brain damage and death. And so we had talked with them, brought in people from the Epilepsy Foundation to do trainings, and made sure that they understood all the signs and symptoms of seizures and any thing that might possibly be going on. They had a very strict seizure protocol to follow. But I came to pick him up one day, and the teacher said, I just now woke Dan up. He fell asleep when he got here, and he's been asleep the whole time. And I asked her, I said, did you check him often? She said, well, he was with us in the same room, so we just made sure he was sleeping. And I said, well, sleeping can be masked by status. He could have died at any point in the 3 hours he was with you, and you never checked for his alertness, checked his vitals. And she said, oh, no, I didn't think anything like that could happen to him. So she had totally forgotten all the lessons that had been taught to her. We were, needless to say, very concerned about that. And after that point, we had lots and lots and lots of meetings with her to check in and make sure that she understood, make sure she was retrained. That same teacher, we had a really unfortunate IEP meeting with her and with some of the other school officials. We were looking at transition from preschool to kindergarten, and we're in a meeting with lots and lots of facilitators and teachers, and my husband Dan and I were really advocating for more services for Dan. Catherine, when you were in kindergarten, we had the opportunity to pay for you to be part of all-day kindergarten, and we wanted that same opportunity for Dan because we felt like, because Dan was nonverbal, because he was developmentally delayed, behind in all milestones, that we wanted him to have more time in the classroom, more time with instruction to try and catch up and bridge those gaps. And the school administrator, who was an older gentleman, leaned across the table at me and said, oh, honey, you just need to take Dan home and love on him, and you don't need to worry about all this schooling yet. And I can still remember the feelings I had at that moment, and I knew I was going to start crying, and I looked at my husband and smiled and gave him a little wave like, I can't do anymore. And I left the IEP meeting with 15 adults. Pause that for a second.
So tell me all about, you mentioned some really awesome teachers who really helped Daniel, but you also did mention that there were some who needed more improvement, and there was a very difficult, I remember, ILP meeting. Right?
IEP meeting?
IEP meeting.
Yes, there was.
All about Daniel that really could have gone better, and it went entirely the wrong way. So how did that happen?
So we were in preschool still, getting ready to transition to kindergarten. And we were advocating for Dan to receive some additional services because in this city where we live, you had the option of paying for all-day kindergarten, and that was the option we had exercised with you, Catherine. You were a year ahead of Dan, so we paid for you to have all-day kindergarten, and we wanted to pay for Dan to have all-day kindergarten because we felt like because of his developmental delays, he needed more time in the classroom, not less time. And so the school did not agree with that, did not want Dan to be in all-day kindergarten. And so to the IEP meeting, they brought 2 of everybody. And it wasn't 2 of everybody for the purposes of transition. It was 2 of everybody to prove their point. So they had all these teachers that were all saying that, yes, they agreed with the school's decision. They thought that more, I guess, would make a better case. But all it did was put 15 people on one side of the table and your dad and I at the other side of the table saying, Dan needs more. Dan needs more teaching time, not less. Dan needs more support, not less support, to catch up and make gains. At the time, the school was not aware, but we had been doing brain scans with Dan, and the neurologists were telling us we're not sure what's going on with Dan's brain, but he appears to have some degrading happening, and we're not sure if that's going to lead to brain damage, to death, and we don't know what's going on. And we had just gotten those results within that week, and we're planning on sharing them at the meeting. But the meeting started bad and continued to get worse. And at one point, the administrator looked across the table at me, the one who was running the meeting, said, "Honey, you don't need to worry about all this schooling for Dan. You just need to take him home and love on him." And I thought it was the most insulting thing I'd ever heard in my life. Felt like we were in a fight for Dan's life. We felt like we were in a fight for Dan to make gains to try and catch up and be with his peers. And this administrator was acting like, we just needed to go walk through a field of daisies and be all fluffy. That was the end of the meeting. I started to cry. I stood up and walked out and left your dad to pick up the pieces. And he very politely let them know, this is not what we expect of a school. We expect a school that supports and wants the best for a child, not for a child to go home and be loved on. We want Dan to be loved. We do love Dan, and we love Dan so much we want the best for him for his education. So we ended up going to mediation and extensive IEP meetings after that, looking for some form of mediation that would be successful. We ended up pulling Dan out of the school system and taking him to a different school for a while to provide him with the supports that he needed. But that was definitely a time when we could have all worked together in a much more cooperative way to support Dan. But having said that, overall, I think Dan's teachers have tried really hard, and we've tried hard to be good advocates and supports for Dan and for the teachers that work with him. One of the ways that we do that is we've got a communication system going. So Dan is still working on continence, and so one of the ways that we support and make sure that he is healthy and safe is we have a chart that we use every day that we fill out virtually every day. See a few blank spots there if you can see that closely. But we support his continence by charting any time that he is wet, dry, uses the restroom, and needs any support so that we can make sure that he's not in any way constipated or having any UTI issues, anything going on. We also do a home to school communication sheet where we fill out any concerns that we have and the teachers fill in the main work that he's done for the day. This is really vital for us and for any parent of a child who's nonverbal, because without this, we don't know what his day is like. You and the girls come home every day and tell us, we had a great day, we played with our friends, we did this, we did that. And Dan doesn't have the ability to share that with us unless we can take that conversation with him. We've used his iPad, actually, and teachers have taken pictures, and his peers have taken pictures, especially on field trips or when they're doing things around the classroom, so that we can open up Dan's iPad and look at pictures that are in there and say, hey, I see you had a lot of fun with Chandler today. It looks like you had a great time on the field trip. La Rosa's looks like it was a lot of fun. That's made a huge difference. So having that iPad that travels to and from school, and that's an iPad that we purchased for Dan solely for him to use at school, but it travels back and forth, and that's a great way for us. It has his communication systems on it in addition to the PEX system which he uses, and it really allows us to have a great homeschool connection. We also make sure that we provided the school with the things that we have at home that match, that help Dan have that comfort level that he needs. So we have matching couches at school and home that we provided for the school so that helps him to kind of decompress during the day. We provided weighted blankets, weighted vests, and a lot of his adapted equipment, like his adapted scissors, and we have adapted puzzles and different things because Dan works best on a slant, so he has a slant board with Velcro, and then all of his works have Velcro. This is actually an older work that he did when he was in preschool, and we make sure we provide all that so that all this is being reinforced from school to home. And not all families have the ability to set up systems like this, but it's great when the schools are able to, and teachers are able to say, hey, here are some things, here are some pictures and some activities that we're doing, so that families can reinforce that at home when they're able to.
Great. And how have preschool teachers kind of helped out with having Daniel's medical needs being met?
Yeah, I think overall as teachers have done a fantastic job, especially when we have communication systems like this in place. It really helps to make sure his medical needs are met. All of his medications, we do trainings at the beginning of the year and the middle of the year a lot of times to make sure we are all aware of exactly what medications he's on and what he might need at school. Because he's got epilepsy and he has allergies, he has emergency meds, Diastat and EpiPen, that he carries with him, as well as some other seizure precautions. He also, a lot of times, if we think he's in any pain, we give Tylenol and Motrin, so those travel with him in contained boxes, and then there are duplicates at school, but that way he has them. The nurses can administer them at school, or bus drivers have them on the bus. They've all been trained to use his emergency meds, so we're all set and ready to go. So lots and lots of good communication has made a huge difference.
All right. Bye,
Bye,
Mom.
Catherine.